Imagine walking into a bakery in Berlin in the late autumn of 1923. You aren't carrying a wallet or even a heavy purse. Instead, you are pushing a wooden wheelbarrow, piled high with thick stacks of paper currency, bound in twine. Your arms ache from the weight of it. You reach the counter and ask for a single loaf of rye bread. The baker doesn't even look at the denominations on the notes. He doesn't count the bills. Instead, he takes a ruler, measures the height of the stacks of cash, and tells you it's not enough. You need another 6 inches of paper if you want to eat today. As you turn to leave, frustrated and hungry, a thief knocks you aside, but he doesn't steal the money. He tips the cash onto the cobblestones, grabs your wheelbarrow, and runs away. In Germany in 1923, the wicker and wood of the basket were worth infinitely more than the trillions of marks it carried. This is not a tall tale or a work of historical fiction. This was the lived reality for millions of people during the Weimar Hyperinflation, one of the most catastrophic economic collapses in human history. It is a story of how a sophisticated industrial superpower saw its society disintegrate in a matter of months, not because of a famine or a plague, but because of a total breakdown in the value of money. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to a time when the world was at a breaking point and look at the series of gambles, debts, and delusions that led a nation into the abyss. The story begins not in 1923, but in 1914, at the outbreak of the First World War. Like most nations entering the conflict, the German Empire assumed the war would be short and glorious. To fund the massive costs of mobilization, the German government made a fateful decision. They suspended the gold standard. Before the war, the German mark was backed by physical gold, ensuring its stability. But as the costs of the war skyrocketed, the government decided it would not tax its citizens to pay for the conflict. Instead, they would borrow money and print it. The logic was simple, if arrogant. Germany would win the war, annex resource-rich territories from its enemies, and force the defeated allies to pay back all of Germany's war debts. It was a massive financial gamble on a military outcome. But Germany did not win. By 1918, the country was exhausted, its military was collapsing, and a revolution at home forced the Kaiser to abdicate. The new government, a fragile democracy known as the Weimar Republic, inherited a nightmare. They were saddled with the astronomical debts they had run up to fight the war, but they had no victory spoils to pay them off. Then came the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. The Allied powers, led by France and Britain, were determined to ensure Germany could never threaten Europe again. They stripped Germany of 10% of its population, 13% of its territory, and its most valuable coal and iron mines. Most devastatingly, they imposed reparations, a massive bill for the damages of the war. The initial sum was left blank, a terrifying blank check hanging over the German economy. When the figure was finally set in 1921, it was 132 billion gold marks. To put that into perspective, it was more than 3 times the total value of all the goods and services Germany produced in a year. The Germans were expected to pay this in gold or foreign currency, not the increasingly worthless paper marks they were printing. The economic trap was set. The government was broke, the people were hungry, and the international community was demanding payments that the country simply could not afford. As 1921 turned into 1922, the value of the mark began to slide faster. At the start of the war, 4 marks would buy you 1 American dollar. By the end of 1921, it took 190 marks to buy a dollar. By the summer of 1922, it was 400. This was high inflation, but it wasn't yet the madness that was to come. The real breaking point arrived in January 1923. Germany defaulted on a delivery of timber and coal to France, part of their reparation payments. It wasn't a massive default, but the French government, led by Raymond Poincaré, had lost patience. They sent French and Belgian troops to occupy the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of Germany. The French intention was to take the coal and steel by force. The German response was passive resistance. The government told the workers in the Ruhr to go on strike, to refuse to mine coal or run the factories for the occupiers. To support these millions of striking workers and their families, the German government did the only thing it knew how to do. It printed more money. They were paying people to stay home and produce nothing. This was the spark that turned a controlled burn into a firestorm. Suddenly, there were billions of marks flooding the economy, but there were no goods being produced to buy with them. The basic law of supply and demand took over with a vengeance. By July 1923, a dollar was worth 160,000 marks. By August, it was 1 million. By November, the exchange rate reached the staggering, incomprehensible figure of 4.2 trillion marks to a single dollar. The physical reality of this collapse was surreal. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, couldn't print money fast enough. They hired over 130 private printing companies to work around the clock. Over 30,000 people were employed just to keep the presses running. They eventually gave up on the elaborate designs of traditional banknotes. They began printing on only one side of the paper. Then, they stopped printing new designs altogether and simply took old bills and stamped 1 billion marks over the original 1,000 marks denomination. Ink became so scarce that the smell of fresh currency filled the streets of every city. Life for the average German became a race against time. Prices didn't change by the month or the week. They changed by the hour. A worker would be paid his wages at noon and immediately be given a half-hour break to run to the stores. If he waited until the end of his shift at 5 o'clock, his day's wages might not even buy a loaf of bread. People would stand in line at a cafe, and by the time they reached the front of the queue, the price of the coffee they had ordered had doubled. There are stories of people ordering 2 beers at once because the second beer would get warm slower than the price would go up. The psychological toll was devastating. A phenomenon known as zero stroke began to emerge, a mental condition where people would feel dizzy and confused when trying to calculate the endless strings of zeros on their banknotes and bills. A simple shopping trip required the mathematical skills of an astrophysicist. People stopped using wallets and started using suitcases, hampers, and, yes, wheelbarrows. In some towns, local businesses stopped using the mark entirely and issued their own emergency money, or Notgeld, backed by things like bushels of rye or kilowatts of electricity. The social fabric of Germany began to tear. The biggest losers were the middle class, the teachers, the civil servants, the pensioners, and the families who had spent decades diligently saving their money in bank accounts. In a matter of weeks, a lifetime of thrift was erased. A savings account that could have bought a house in 1914 couldn't buy a postage stamp in 1923. These people felt betrayed by their government and by the very concept of the state. They had played by the rules, and the rules had destroyed them. Meanwhile, a small group of people were getting incredibly rich. These were the inflation kings, most notably the industrialist Hugo Stinnes. Stinnes understood the mechanics of the collapse perfectly. He took out massive loans in marks to buy up factories, mines, and real estate. By the time the loans were due, the value of the mark had dropped so much that he could pay back a multi-million mark debt with the equivalent of a few pennies. He eventually controlled a vast empire of over 4,500 companies. To the starving public, men like Stinnes were vultures, picking the carcass of the nation clean. Farmers were also in a unique position. They had the one thing everyone needed, food. They quickly realized that paper marks were worthless, so they stopped selling their produce to the cities. They began to barter. A farmer might trade a dozen eggs for a grand piano or a pig for a gold watch. City dwellers would take their finest possessions, silk dresses, silver cutlery, heirloom violins, and trek out into the countryside, hoping to trade them for a sack of potatoes. The dignity of the German bourgeoisie was stripped away as they begged peasants for scraps of fat. As the economy disintegrated, the political situation turned explosive. People were desperate, and desperate people look for radical solutions. In the shadows of the hyperinflation, extremist movements on both the left and the right began to swell. In November 1923, at the absolute height of the economic madness, a young fringe politician named Adolf Hitler saw his opportunity. He attempted to seize power in Munich in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. While the coup failed and Hitler was sent to prison, the chaos of the hyperinflation had provided him with a powerful narrative of grievance and betrayal that he would use for the rest of his career. He blamed the November criminals, the Jews, and the international bankers for the destruction of the German currency, and millions of people, having lost everything, were finally ready to listen. So, how did it end? How do you stop a currency that is falling into a bottomless pit? The fever finally broke in late 1923 with the appointment of Hjalmar Schacht as the currency commissioner and Gustav Stresemann as chancellor. They knew they couldn't just print a new version of the mark. Nobody would trust it. They needed a psychological trick to restore faith in money. They introduced a new currency called the Rentenmark. But here was the catch. The government had no gold to back it. Instead, they backed the Rentenmark with a mortgage on all the land and industrial assets of Germany. In reality, you couldn't actually exchange your paper Rentenmark for a piece of a factory, but the idea that it was backed by something physical, something real, was enough. They strictly limited the amount of Rentenmarks that could be printed. The exchange rate was set at 1 Rentenmark for every 1 trillion old paper marks. Overnight, 12 zeros were slashed from the prices. The miracle of the Rentenmark worked. People, exhausted by the chaos, wanted to believe in the new money, and because they believed in it, it became stable. The hyperinflation ended almost as quickly as it had begun, but while the currency was stabilized, the scars remained. The Weimar Republic never truly recovered from the trauma of 1923. The middle class, the traditional bedrock of any democracy, had been wiped out financially and humiliated socially. Their trust in democratic institutions was gone. When the Great Depression hit just 6 years later in 1929, the German people didn't just see a recession, they saw the return of the nightmare. They remembered the wheelbarrows and the hunger, and this time they turned to the man who promised them order and bread at any cost. The legacy of the Weimar hyperinflation still shapes the world today, particularly in Europe. If you've ever wondered why the German central bank and the European central bank are so obsessed with keeping inflation low, often to the frustration of other nations, the answer lies in the history of 1923. For Germany, inflation isn't just an economic statistic or a policy challenge. It is a cultural trauma, a ghost that haunts the national psyche. It is a reminder of how quickly the thin veneer of civilization can peel away when the medium of exchange, the very thing that allows us to trust one another in a marketplace, turns to dust. The story of the wheelbarrows of cash is a warning. It tells us that money is not just paper or metal or digits on a screen. Money is a social contract. It is a collective agreement that a certain token represents a certain amount of human labor and value. When a government breaks that contract by printing away its debts, it doesn't just destroy the economy, it destroys the trust that holds a society together.
In the autumn of 1923, the German people learned that you can have trillions of marks and still have nothing. They learned that when money dies, the law of the jungle returns. And as we look back at those images of children playing with stacks of cash like building blocks, or women burning banknotes to keep their stoves warm, we are reminded that the stability we take for granted is more fragile than it seems. The Weimar hyperinflation remains the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when the math of a nation no longer adds up, and the people are left to pay the price in wheelbarrows. As the Rentenmark took hold and the dust began to settle, Germany entered a brief period of prosperity known as the Golden Twenties. Berlin became a center of art, science, and nightlife. But the foundation was built on sand. The country was now heavily dependent on American loans under the Dawes Plan to pay its reparations and keep its economy moving. The wealth of the 1920s was a facade that masked the deep structural damage done during the hyperinflation years. The internal cohesion of the country was fractured. The winners of the inflation, the speculators and the industrialists, lived in luxury, while the losers, the former middle class, watched from the sidelines with growing resentment. This resentment was a slow-burning fuse. The hyperinflation had effectively redistributed wealth in a way that felt profoundly unfair. It punished the virtuous, those who saved and believed in the state, and rewarded the cynical, those who borrowed and bet against the currency. This moral inversion left a vacuum where traditional values used to be. When the American stock market crashed in 1929 and the loans were called in, the German economy didn't just dip, it shattered. Unemployment surged to 6 million. The ghost of 1923 returned, and this time, There was no miracle of the Rentenmark to save the Republic. The political landscape of the early 1930s was a direct consequence of the economic wreckage of the decade before. The moderate parties, which had overseen the inflation and the subsequent austerity, lost all credibility. The voters flocked to the fringes. On one side, the communists promised to overthrow the capitalist system that had failed so spectacularly. On the other side, the National Socialists promised a return to national strength and an end to the interest slavery that they claimed was at the heart of Germany's problems. When Hitler finally became chancellor in 1933, his first priority was to ensure that the economic chaos of the Weimar years could never happen again. He did this through a combination of massive state spending on rearmament and public works, and a command economy that strictly controlled prices and wages. To the German people, who had spent a decade in a state of constant financial terror, the loss of their political freedom seemed like a small price to pay for the return of a stable currency and a steady job. The memory of the wheelbarrow of cash was perhaps the most effective propaganda tool the Nazi Party ever had. Looking back from the 21st century, the Weimar hyperinflation serves as a laboratory for economists. It provides a clear, if horrifying, example of what happens when a central bank loses its independence and becomes a tool of a desperate government. It shows the limits of fiat currency, money that has value only because the government says it does. If the people stop believing the government, the money ceases to exist in any meaningful sense. Today, we live in an era of massive government debt and unprecedented central bank intervention. While we are far from the trillion% inflation rates of 1923, the lessons of Weimar are more relevant than ever. They remind us that the value of our currency is tied to the stability of our institutions. They remind us that inflation is not just a matter of rising prices, but a matter of social justice and political stability. The image of the thief stealing the wheelbarrow and leaving the money is more than just a quirky historical anecdote. It is a metaphor for a society that has lost its way. It represents a moment where the physical objects of life, the tools, the food, the shelter, become the only things that matter, because the abstract systems we've built to manage them have failed. The people of Weimar Germany weren't less intelligent or less hardworking than we are today. They were caught in a systemic collapse that was set in motion years before it reached its peak. They were the victims of a government that tried to solve its problems by manipulating the very definition of value. And in the end, they learned the hardest lesson of all, that when you print money to solve every problem, you eventually reach a point where the money itself becomes the biggest problem of all. As we conclude this journey through one of history's darkest economic chapters, we are left with a sobering thought. The Weimar hyperinflation didn't happen in an ancient, primitive society. It happened in a modern, literate, and highly advanced nation. It happened because of a series of choices made by leaders who thought they could outsmart the basic laws of economics. It serves as a permanent reminder that the economy is not just a machine, but a reflection of the trust we place in each other and our future. When that trust is gone, all the paper in the world won't buy you a single loaf of bread. The wheelbarrows are long gone, replaced by digital transactions and global markets, but the story of the mark and the people who saw their lives disappear in a cloud of zeros remains one of the most important stories of the modern age. It is a story of how a nation lost its soul by losing its currency and the terrible price the world paid for that loss in the years that followed. It is the story of the Weimar hyperinflation, a time when money died and a nightmare was born.
If you liked this video, please hit the like and subscribe button for more.